Well, globalization that was once defined by openness, by the belief that integration would deepen steadily and also predictably. Now, today we inhabit a more complex world that one is digitally connected but strategically also leveraged. Now, technology that has now become the site of competition rather than a neutral facilitator of growth, and supply chains that are now being redesigned not merely for efficiency but for resilience and for control as well. So all of this that is now becoming a major factor, Sumita, as we talk about the supply chains and the efficiency, but also how investment routes are now being reconsidered.
Absolutely, and like you stated, investment routes are being reconsidered through the lens of national interest. Strategic alliances are recalibrated as geopolitical equations shift. For India, these changes have real implications. For what? Well, for exports, for foreign investment, for technological autonomy, and for long-term competitiveness. The central question then is whether the world is moving towards decoupling, selective integration, or a new hybrid model of globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, to help us understand all of these tectonic shifts, we now have a very, very special guest who's joining us on stage.
Well, this is for emerging economies. Please join your hands together to welcome Professor E Harsisson, economist and former dean, Haas School of Business, University of California, Berkeley.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here, hosted by the Tynes Group Global Business Summit. I've been asked to talk briefly about global trade and climate change. We are truly at a pivotal moment. My name is E Harsisson, and I've come to you from Berkeley, California. So let's start with a little bit of data here. How do we measure what is happening in the world in terms of globalization? The standard way to measure globalization is to look at the share of exports in GDP. That orange line that you see there, that is India. India has had a remarkable transformation, moving from 1960, a share of exports in GDP of less than 5%, all the way to the end where you see it has overtaken a number of countries. Exports now as a share of GDP exceed the United States. The United States is at the bottom there, that dotted line at the bottom. And we have now, India has now surpassed China with a share of exports in GDP above China's. So remarkable progress, particularly post-1990s with the reforms. However, what you should also see there is for all sectors of the world, since the 2008-2009 recession, there is stagnation. There is stagnation in the share of global trade and GDP. It is happening across all countries. And so we are at a turning point here where we cannot expect the same increases in global trade that we saw literally for the last century. In another way, India has also shown remarkable progress. In addition to that remarkable performance that we saw for trade, there's also a shift in the global trade winds when it comes to global direct investment. If you look in those graphs, you see that over 20 years, the biggest share of inward foreign investment was going to China, about 40%. No longer today. Over the last 5 years, the share of foreign investment going into China has dropped dramatically, and it's been replaced by India. India now accounts for most of the share going into Asia. Although the levels have not increased, the share is definitely bigger, and greenfield investment in particular is picking up, another very bright wind on the horizon. Another way in which India has surpassed all large countries is in its growth rate. The IMF's World Economic Outlook, which is the barometer for judging growth, estimates that India's GDP growth in 2026 will be 6%, exceeding China's, exceeding all large countries. India there is the dark country, the dark green country in the map. You'll see there are very few dark green countries in that map, suggesting very few countries with this level of growth, with the exception of some fast-moving, fast-growing African economies. So here we see all the positive moments. However, there are some very serious headwinds that are worth talking about. Big challenges. In the last year, the United States, under President Trump, imposed the highest tariffs that the United States has seen in a century. Not only did he impose very high tariffs, but he imposed some of the highest tariffs on India. On Liberation Day, he imposed tariffs of almost 50%, whereas before that, tariffs vis-a-vis India were in the single digits, 2 to 3%. These are dramatic changes which are difficult to predict where they will go. An even bigger challenge, climate change. It was right that we began with the minister in charge of food in India, food processing. This is a very big concern. The graph that you see there on the left shows you the increase in temperature that has steadily gone up since we began recording temperature in the world. It has gone up by over 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is the critical number that climate experts warn that if we exceed or surpass, we will continue to have terrible, devastating events. We are now at the level of surpassing 1.5 degrees centigrade, and the last 2 years were the hottest years on record. I want to call your attention to an amazing talk at Davos last month by the former IMF Managing Director and Chief Economist, Geeta Gopinath. Geeta Gopinath made the very provocative statement at Davos that pollution in India is a bigger economic threat than any tariffs that the United States can impose. And she came out with some startling numbers. She pointed out that in a recent World Bank report, as many as 1.7 deaths every year in India, 1.7 million deaths in India every year result from the combination of climate change and pollution. This is 18% of all mortality in India. She claimed that this was so important that it would outweigh any tariff imposed, any cost of any tariffs imposed by the President of the United States. To put this in perspective, today, if you go to the air quality index in New Delhi, today it was hovering around 200. That's 23x, 23 times what the World Health Organization says is the safe level for air quality. That is what we are seeing here. But there is hope. What I have shown you here, if you can see it, you can see the yellow lines. The yellow lines are India's particulate matter, 2.5, which measures air pollution across many of India's largest cities. As you can see, since 2011, it's been rising, only starting to decline. India is home to some of the most polluted cities in the world. But there is hope. The red lines that you see there, which were dramatically high, just as high as India, and have now declined precipitously, those are all the Chinese cities. So what China has done is it went from particulate matter, which was equal to or exceeded India's in many cities, and it dramatically reduced pollution in all those cities. It's now below the world average, which in this graph is the dotted line. So there is opportunity, there is hope, but this is a very serious challenge. So given these challenges, given what we heard from the minister, from our honorable minister in the previous talk, what do I, as an outsider, feel should be priorities going forward? First priority would be for India to deepen ties with friends and contain others. What do I mean by that? Friendshoring, finding ways to be resilient, not worry as much about efficiency as in the past, but worry a lot about safety of supply chains. One very important accomplishment in the last several weeks has been the signing of the free trade agreement between the EU and India. Together, they account for 25% of global GDP. The EU made some very important commitments. They're lowering or eliminating tariffs on 90% of their exports, on 90% of their home market goods. They're giving India the opportunity to make inroads in many areas: garments, foodstuffs, food processing, you name it. In return, they are asking for access to the Indian market. In particular, the agreement will give them lower tariffs on exports of lower priced cars to India, on exports of olive oil, on exports of wine to India. This is a tremendous opportunity for both regions that are not affected, that are not part of the US, China, Russia group. So this is very exciting and very strategic. What should India do about the US and China? The US, take it from me, as a US citizen, the US is not reliable under President Trump. A containment strategy would be my advice. Find a way to accept the offer of lower tariffs from President Trump, but be careful in committing to too much. As you heard from the minister, agriculture in India is important. Many, many individuals rely on it. Opening up the agricultural market in response for lower tariffs into the Indian market would be a very dangerous strategy. This was the strategy that Mexico embarked in the North American Free Trade Agreement, and many farmers in Mexico were deeply hurt by that process. I would argue for containment and careful negotiation, reciprocity at all times. Although Trump's tariffs are called reciprocal, they are not. India should demand reciprocity. With China, India needs to find a way to control China's enormous trade surplus surge. It's at levels never before seen. Any agreements must be contingent on China restricting that enormous trade surplus in the direction of India. Priority number 2, addressing pollution and climate change. It's very difficult to become the number 1 country in the world with these kinds of air quality levels. My own research on India has shown that price mechanisms could be really important. In particular, setting differential prices on coal could reduce consumption of coal and clean up the air. That's what the data for India shows. Those could be combined. Pricing mechanisms can be combined with command and control policies, such as those that the Supreme Court Action Plan helped institute over a number of years. The combination of price mechanisms to encourage smaller enterprises to address consumption of dirty fuels, and Supreme Court action plans that targeted the largest and most important companies had significant effects on different outcomes. Green industrial policy is an important topic. We could spend many hours talking about it. I would just suggest one thing from my research on China. One of the reasons that China's industrial policy was so successful is that it was combined in conjunction with increasing competition, not reducing it. So using tariffs to promote, for example, solar energy would be the absolute worst strategy. Competition is your friend. Last priority. India has a tremendous asset. The size of the domestic market is so large that India can use domestic competition to create levels of performance that many smaller countries do not have the opportunity to use. China has used fierce domestic competition to its advantage to force domestic enterprises to become world-class. India can go much further in reducing the barriers to domestic competition and continuing to battle the license raj. Let me give you, in conclusion, a personal example. I wanting to come to India after not having been here for many years, I applied for a visa. After hours of working on my first visa application, it was denied. I was counseled to try a tourist visa, which I did. After hours of working on my tourist visa was eventually denied. Third time, you can tell I really wanted to be here today. I tried for a third time for a visa. I finally got a visa. The details required just to get a visa to come to India just for 5 days are crazy compared to many of the other countries that I have traveled to. I teach at University of California, Berkeley. One of my students, whose family immigrated from India, told me the story of how they carry large suitcases everywhere they go, filled with all the forms that over the years they have had to fill out and that they think they might need one day. In applying for a visa, I was asked for my visa information from 1986, when I was barely out of high school. Of course I didn't have it. I've moved so many times since then. So my urge to you is to think about the benefits of competition in this incredible country and continue to work on enhancing domestic competition and battling the license raj. It has been a deep pleasure to be back here after so many years. Thank you so much for the opportunity to address you.